Elena Kade was 23 years old the first time she heard the signal, and for the first 4 months, everyone she worked with was certain it was nothing. She was working the deep listening array on the graveyard rotation, the shift nobody senior wanted, monitoring background noise from a stretch of sky so unremarkable it had never even been given a proper name, only a catalog number. The console in front of her had been quiet for 6 straight hours when the waveform spiked, a single burst, jagged and strange, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. She almost logged it as instrument error, almost. Instead, she pulled the raw data, ran it against every known interference pattern in the archive, and found nothing that matched. Not solar noise, not a satellite echo, not a known pulsar. She sat with it until the sun came up on a planet. The signal hadn't come anywhere near, and by the time her shift ended, she had already decided she wasn't going to let it go. Her supervisor was less convinced. "You're telling me a research assistant on her first posting picked up a structured transmission that every automated filter in this facility missed," he said, not quite looking up from his own console. "I'm telling you the filters are built to catch known patterns," Elena said. "This isn't a known pattern, that's the point." "It's noise, Kade. Space is full of noise." "Then let me prove it's noise. Give me 2 weeks with the raw data." He gave her 1 week mostly, she suspected, to make the argument go away. She used every hour of it, running comparative analysis against every documented false positive in the archive's history, and at the end of it, she had 1 page of findings and a stubborn refusal to write the word inconclusive at the bottom of it. "It repeats," she told him when the week was up, "not on a fixed interval, but it repeats. Nothing natural does that. A malfunctioning beacon could." "Then it's a malfunctioning beacon transmitting from somewhere with no charted stellar bodies, no known debris field, and no reason to be there at all." He didn't have an answer for that. He also didn't approve further resources, and Elena went back to her regular duties with the signal's raw data quietly copied onto a drive she kept in her personal effects, because some questions, once asked properly, refused to stop being asked just because nobody in charge wants to hear the answer. It took her 3 more years, working the problem in whatever spare hours her actual assignments allowed, before she cracked enough of the signal's structure to be certain of one thing: it wasn't noise, and it wasn't a malfunction. It was a message, and it was still repeating, faint and patient, exactly where it had always been. In the years that followed, Elena learned the particular loneliness of being the only person in a room who believes something is true. She learned to recognize the specific tone colleagues used when they meant to be kind and were being condescending instead, the careful, gentle way they asked how her signal was coming along, as though she were tending a garden that had never once produced anything worth harvesting. She kept at it anyway. She spent her evenings building a small, informal team, first one linguist who found the anomaly interesting enough to run independently, then a systems engineer curious enough to double-check her decoding methodology without being asked, then slowly, a handful of others who had each, in their own way, been unable to walk past an unanswered question without picking at it. None of them were assigned to the project officially. All of them worked on it anyway, in whatever margins their real assignments left behind. "You know, this could still be nothing," her linguist colleague, a quiet, precise woman named Priya Anand, told her during one of their late sessions 4 years in, both of them staring at a partial translation matrix that refused to fully resolve. "Even if it's structured, even if it repeats, it could be an automated system with no one left alive to answer for it." "It could be," Elena agreed, "but automated systems don't usually change. This one hasn't changed, not once in 4 years. "No," Elena admitted, "it hasn't. But if there's even a chance someone's still listening on the other end of it, waiting the way I'm waiting, I'd rather spend the next 4 years finding out than spend them assuming the answer is no, because assuming is easier." Priya didn't have an answer for that, but she kept showing up to the sessions anyway, which Elena had learned by then was usually answer enough. 600 light-years away, in a place no human had ever charted, Chiral Athras climbed the access ladder to the beacon relay for the 4,000th time, counted with the same small, private ritual she'd kept since she first inherited the post from her mother. The Hollow Vault had not always been called that. Once before the collision that crippled its main drive and tore through 3 of its 7 habitat rings, it had simply been called the Ithranai Ascendant, a colony vessel carrying 11,000 people toward a world their scouts had promised would be paradise. The collision had happened 11 years ago. The paradise world was still 8 years distant at sublight, unreachable now that the drive was dead, and of the 11,000 who had once filled its rings, fewer than 400 remained, huddled in the 2 habitat sections still capable of supporting life. Chiral had been 19 when the collision happened. She was 30 now, and had spent every one of the last 10 years maintaining a beacon that the Vault's council had voted, on 4 separate occasions, to shut down. "It draws power we don't have to spare," Councillor Rehan As said. At the 5th vote, the one Chiral had specifically requested to attend so she could argue against it in person. "Power that keeps Section 4's heating grid from failing. Power that keeps our remaining hydroponics running. You are asking this council to choose a signal that has gone unanswered for a decade over the people still breathing in this vault today. I'm asking this council to remember why we built the beacon in the first place," Chiral said. "We are not the last Ithrani in existence. Somewhere, there are people who would want to know we're still here, if only the signal ever reaches them. And if it never does, how many more winters do we sacrifice to a hope with no evidence behind it?" Chiral didn't have a clean answer to that. She'd never had one, not once in 10 years of arguing the same argument in slightly different words. What she had instead was a habit, worn smooth by repetition, of climbing the access ladder every rotation cycle to check the relay's power draw, recalibrate its aim, and reroute enough spare capacity from the Vault's failing secondary systems to keep the transmission alive, usually without telling the council exactly how she managed it. The 5th vote failed by 1 ballot. She never told anyone that the deciding vote had come from her own mother's oldest friend, a woman who had lost 2 children in the collision, and had told Chiral, privately, afterward, that she voted to keep the beacon running not because she believed anyone would answer, but because turning it off would have felt like agreeing that her children's deaths meant nothing at all. Chiral understood that reasoning better than she wanted to. The years between votes were not gentle to the Hollow Vault. Section 3's atmospheric scrubbers failed permanently in Year 6, forcing a consolidation that packed the remaining population into spaces meant for a fraction of their number. Year 8 brought a slow, grinding food crisis when a hydroponics bloom failed without warning, and for 4 months the entire vault existed on strict rationing, while Sana and a small team worked around the clock to rebuild the algae cultures from the few surviving samples. Chiral remembered that winter specifically, because it was the only time in 10 years she genuinely considered letting the council win the vote, not because she'd stopped believing in the beacon, but because watching children go hungry while she diverted power toward a signal with no proof of an audience had started to feel like a cruelty she wasn't sure she had the right to keep choosing. She raised the question with Sana one exhausted night in the hydroponics bay, both of them running on too little sleep and less food. "If it's costing us this much," Chiral said, "if it's really coming down to a choice between the beacon and the children eating, I don't know that I can keep defending it." Sana considered that for a long time before answering. "When my children were taken in the collision, I used to think about all the years I spent teaching them to never give up on anything worth keeping. I used to wonder if that was a lie I told them, something I believed because it sounded good, not because it was actually true." She turned to fresh algae cutting over in her hands. "I don't think it's a lie. But I think it only stays true if the people who believe it are willing to pay something real for it, not recklessly, not past the point where paying it costs more than it's worth, but something real." She looked at Chiral. "You'll know when the cost stops being worth it. I don't think you're there yet. I think you're just tired, and tired makes everything feel like it costs more than it does." The hydroponics crisis resolved within the month, the cultures rebuilt, the rationing eased, and Chiral kept climbing the ladder every rotation after that with the same quiet stubbornness she'd started with, though she never again let herself forget how close she'd come to stopping. Back on Earth, Elena Kade spent the better part of a decade turning a research anomaly into something that could survive contact with a funding committee. It was not by any measure an easy decade. The signals decoded content, once she and a small team of increasingly convinced linguists finally cracked its structure, described a stranded population, a crippled vessel, and coordinates so far beyond the edge of charted space that the nearest existing human vessel would need roughly 40 years to reach them at maximum sustainable speed. 40 years was, functionally, the same as never, and every review board Elena presented the findings to understood that math immediately. "You're asking us to fund a rescue mission for a message that's already a decade old," said Director Amara Solis, the closest thing the Deep Space Program had to a final word on where its limited resources went. "Even if the people who sent it are still alive, which is not guaranteed, we don't have a vessel that can reach them within a human lifetime." "Then we build one," Elena said. With what budget? Half the committee already believes this signal is an artifact of instrument error you refuse to let go of. The other half doesn't, and the ones who ran the linguistic analysis independently, without my involvement, came back with the same conclusion I did. This is a real distress call from a real population, and it has been repeating for at least a decade, which means whoever sent it either doesn't know we exist or has stopped believing anyone is listening. Solis studied her for a long moment. You've spent 7 years on this. I have. What happens if I say no again? Then I keep working on it in whatever hours I can find, the same way I have every year since I was 23, because the alternative is deciding that a signal too far away to answer easily isn't worth answering at all, and I'm not willing to make that decision on behalf of whoever's still alive out there. It wasn't the argument that changed Solis's mind, not directly. What changed her mind, eventually, was a quieter conversation 2 years later, after an unrelated engineering breakthrough in compact fusion drive efficiency cut projected travel times for long-range vessels by nearly 60%, a discovery that had nothing to do with Elena's signal and everything to do with making the previously impossible merely extremely difficult. Solis called Elena into her office the week the numbers came back. 40 years is now closer to 11, she said, sliding the report across the desk. Still a hard sell to a public that's never heard of your signal and a legislature that would rather spend the money closer to home. Then don't sell it as a rescue mission for people nobody's heard of, Elena said. Sell it as what it actually is. A test of the new drive technology with a genuine, worthwhile destination instead of an empty proving run into nowhere. Solis almost smiled. You've thought about this. I've had 10 years to think about it. The vessel that eventually emerged from that quiet reframing was named the Providence Line, funded in careful, unglamorous increments from a research budget nobody outside the program paid close attention to, built not as a grand public rescue mission, but as an unremarkable engineering test that happened, by design, to be pointed at a very particular set of coordinates. Elena served as its chief communications officer. It was, everyone agreed, the only appropriate assignment for the person who had refused to let the signal go for 10 straight years. The Providence Line's departure was quiet, by design. Captain Idris Voller, a broad, unhurried man who had spent most of his career running unglamorous survey missions nobody remembered afterward, addressed his crew of 40 on the morning they left dock with the same plainness he brought to everything. Most of you signed on for a drive test, he said. I want to be honest about what that actually means. Somewhere at the far end of this route, there may be several hundred people who have been waiting 11 years for someone to answer a call for help. There may also be nothing. The signal could have gone silent years ago. The people who sent it may already be gone. He paused, letting that settle. I'm not going to pretend this is a simple mission. I'm going to ask you to treat it like one anyway, because the only way to find out which version of this story we're in is to go and see. The journey took just under 9 years, shortened further by 2 more incremental drive refinements made mid-mission by an engineering crew that treated every improvement as a personal stake in arriving sooner. Elena spent those years doing the only thing that had ever made sense to her, refining the decoded signal, cross-checking it against every new data burst the ship's improved receivers picked up as they closed the distance, watching the transmission grow slowly, incrementally stronger. It was still repeating. That fact alone kept the entire crew moving through the harder stretches of the journey, the mechanical failures, the isolation, the long silent months where nothing changed except the numbers on a countdown. The journey was not without its own crisis of faith. In its 5th year, a secondary containment fault in the ship's primary reactor forced an 11-day shutdown of non-essential systems, while the engineering crew worked to isolate and repair the fault. And for those 11 days, running on backup power with the ship's forward momentum coasting rather than accelerating, the mission's careful timeline slipped by nearly 4 months. Voller called an all-crew briefing on the 9th day, when tempers had begun to fray, and more than one crew member had quietly begun asking whether the mission's entire premise still made sense. I know some of you are wondering if we're chasing something that isn't there anymore, he said, standing in the cramped mess hall with the ship's lighting dimmed to conserve power. I want to be honest about that possibility instead of pretending it away. It has been over a decade since that signal was first recorded. We do not know, and cannot know until we arrive, whether anyone is still alive to receive us. Then why keep pushing the repair schedule so hard? Asked one of the junior engineers, exhaustion evident in her voice. If there's a real chance nobody's there, Why are we killing ourselves to save 4 months? Elena answered before Valar could. Because if there's even a chance somebody's there, 4 months might be the difference between finding them and finding out we were too late by 4 months. I'm not willing to gamble on the smaller chance being true just because it's more convenient to believe. That's easy for you to say. You're not the one who's been rerouting coolant lines with your bare hands for 9 days straight. No, Elena admitted, I'm not, and I won't pretend that's not a real cost you're paying that I'm not paying alongside you. I'm only telling you why I think it's worth paying. She looked around the room, at faces drawn tight with fatigue and doubt. I spent 10 years being the only person in a room who believed a signal was real. I know exactly what it costs to keep believing something when everyone around you has good reasons to stop. I'm not asking any of you to believe it the way I do. I'm asking you to keep doing the work in front of you and let the arrival answer the question none of us can answer from here. The repair was completed on day 11, 4 hours ahead of even the most optimistic revised estimate, largely because the junior engineer who had voiced the loudest doubt spent the final night personally reworking a coupling schematic that shaved critical hours off the remaining timeline. She never fully explained why. Elena suspected she didn't need to. 3 months from arrival, the signal's content shifted for the first time in the entire mission. It's not the same message anymore, Elena reported to Valar, replaying the new burst on the bridge's main display. The structure's different, shorter, less redundant. She looked up. I think someone's still actively maintaining that beacon. This isn't an automated repeat anymore. Somebody changed it. Which means somebody's still alive to change it, Valar said. Which means somebody's still alive to change it, Elena agreed, and felt, for the first time in 9 years of quiet, careful patience, something that was almost hope allowing itself to be spoken aloud. Kyril Athres noticed the new signal on an otherwise unremarkable maintenance rotation, a faint return pulse buried in the noise floor of her own transmission, so subtle she nearly dismissed it as reflected interference before she ran the pattern analysis twice to be certain. It wasn't reflected interference, it was structured, it was a reply. She stood at the relay console for a long time before she trusted herself to move, running the analysis a third time, then a fourth, because 10 years of disappointment had taught her not to trust hope until it had survived every reasonable attempt to disprove it. It survived all 4 attempts. She didn't go to the council first. She went to her mother's old friend, the woman who had cast the deciding vote a decade ago, and found her in the hydroponics bay, tending a crop of nutrient algae that had been keeping the vault's remaining population fed for longer than anyone liked to think about. Sana, Kyril said, and something in her voice must have carried more than she intended, because the older woman turned immediately, expression sharpening. What happened? Someone answered. Sana went very still, answered what? The beacon, 10 years, Sana, 10 years of nothing, and something answered it. It's structured, it's not noise, it's not an echo. Somebody heard us. Sana's hands, still holding a tray of algae cuttings, began to shake, just slightly, and she set the tray down with great care before she allowed herself to sit. Show me, she said, show me, and then we tell the council together, because if I have to stand in that room and explain why I voted to keep that beacon running 11 years after my children died, I would like it to be because I was right, not because I hoped I was. The council meeting that followed was unlike any of the previous 5. Councillor Rehin Ost, who had argued longest and hardest for shutting the beacon down, sat through Kyril's presentation of the reply signal in a silence that lasted long after she finished speaking. You're certain, he said finally, certain this isn't wishful analysis. Certain this isn't the same mistake as the failed automated repeater incident 3 years ago. I ran it 4 times, Kyril said. I'd run it 40 more if it would make you trust it faster, but we don't have 40 more rotations of spare power to test with, and I'd rather spend what we have preparing a response than second-guessing whether we deserve to send one. Rehin was quiet for a long moment. If this is real, he said slowly, if someone genuinely heard us after 10 years, I owe you an apology I don't know how to give properly. I voted to end this 5 times. I believed honestly that continuing to hope was crueler than accepting reality. You weren't wrong to worry about the cost, Kyril said. I just wasn't willing to let the fear of being wrong be the reason we stopped trying. The council voted, for the first time in 10 years, unanimously to divert every spare resource the vault could produce toward strengthening the return transmission, and toward preparing, however impossibly, for the idea that rescue might no longer be a fantasy told to children to help them sleep. The Providence line entered visual range of the Hollow Vault 11 days after that first confirmed reply, and the sight that greeted its crew silenced the bridge more thoroughly than any briefing document had managed to. The vessel was enormous, easily 3 times the length of the Providence line, but wrong in ways that made its scale feel less impressive and more tragic. 2 entire habitat rings hung dark and open to space, hull plating torn away in a wound that had clearly never been repaired, only sealed off and abandoned. The remaining sections glowed faintly, unevenly, the light of a population running its systems on the barest sustainable margin. "Life signs," Voller asked, quiet. "Confirmed," the sensor officer reported, concentrated in the 2 forward sections. "Best estimate, 300 to 400 individuals." Elena stood at her console, watching the numbers resolve, and thought of a 23-year-old radio operator on a graveyard shift who had refused to write the word inconclusive on a report nobody wanted, and felt the entire decade collapse quietly into this single moment. "Open a channel," Voller said. "Let's not make them wait any longer than they already have." Elena opened it herself. "Hollow Vault, this is the Providence line, representing the human systems of Earth. We received your signal. We're sorry it took us this long to answer." There was a pause, agonizingly brief and impossibly long at the same time, before Chiral Athras's voice came through, steadier than she felt. "This is Chiral Athras, beacon keeper of the Hollow Vault," a breath, audibly unsteady despite her effort to control it. "We stopped believing anyone would. Some of us stopped years ago. I want you to know that whatever brought you here, however long it took, it mattered. It still matters." "We'd like to bring your people home," Voller said. "Or as close to home as we can manage, given how far you are from where you meant to go. We're not equipped to move your entire vessel, but we can transport your population, and we've got a decade of preparation behind us for exactly that." The silence that followed was different from the first, filled with something Elena recognized immediately, because she had spent 10 years feeling the edges of it herself. "You built a ship for us," Chiral said slowly, "before you even knew we were still alive." "We built a ship for the possibility that you might be," Elena said, cutting in gently. "It felt like the least dishonest thing to do, given what your signal cost you to keep sending." The evacuation took 6 weeks, careful and unglamorous in the way real rescues almost always are, full of medical assessments, structural surveys, and the slow, patient work of moving nearly 400 exhausted, weary people out of a vessel that had been their entire world for 11 years and into one that felt, for all its careful preparation, impossibly foreign. The first groups to cross over were the children, escorted by medical staff who had spent the transit years training specifically for a physiology they'd never actually treated, working from data models built entirely from Elena's decade-old signal analysis, and refined, in the final months of the voyage, by every scrap of new information the strengthening transmission provided. The children were wary at first, clustering together in the Providence line's unfamiliar corridors, until one of the ship's junior officers, a broad-shouldered man named Teal Marsh, who had spent most of the voyage tending the ship's small hydroponics garden, began quietly teaching a group of them how the garden's growing racks worked. Within days, half the vault's youngest survivors had adopted the garden as an unofficial gathering place, and Tio had adopted, without quite meaning to, an entirely new set of responsibilities nobody had assigned him. Counselor Rehan Ost crossed over during the 3rd week, insisting on personally verifying the safety of each subsequent transfer before allowing more of his people to follow. He found Elena on the observation deck during one of the transfer lulls, staring out at the darkened, wounded shape of the vault they were slowly emptying. "I owe you the same apology I owe Chiral," he said. "I spent a decade arguing that hope was a resource we couldn't afford to keep spending. I still believe caution mattered. I no longer believe I was right to let it override everything else." "You weren't entirely wrong," Elena said. "Hope that isn't paired with something real behind it is just wishful thinking. The only reason any of this worked is because 2 separate groups of people paid for their hope with actual sustained effort for a decade without any guarantee it would matter." She glanced at him. "You made the beacon keeper defend her position for 10 years. That's not nothing. It's part of why the signal she was defending stayed strong enough for us to find." Rehan considered that for a long moment. "That is either a very generous reading of my failures or a very honest one." "Probably both," Elena said. "Most honest readings usually are." By the 5th week, the transfers had become almost routine, a steady rhythm of shuttles moving between the two vessels, medical bays filling and emptying, quarters being reassigned and reconfigured to accommodate a population the Providence Line had never been built to carry, but had, through months of careful preparation, made room for anyway. Sana crossed over in the final group, insisting on staying behind with the last of the hydroponics cultures until every viable strain had been safely transferred, unwilling to let a decade of careful cultivation die in an abandoned vessel, simply because the people who'd tended it were finally leaving. Cairo was among the last to leave, insisting on personally overseeing every group that departed before allowing herself to be evacuated. Elena found her on one of the final trips, standing at the dead beacon relay one last time, hand resting on the console that had carried her voice into the dark for a decade without ever knowing if anyone would hear it. "You don't have to explain why you're still here," Elena said. "I get it. I spent 10 years arguing with people who thought I was chasing an artifact. You spent 10 years keeping a promise nobody else believed you could keep. Those aren't that different." Cairo looked at her for a long moment. "Your council believed you eventually." Ours nearly voted the beacon into silence 5 separate times. "My council didn't believe me either, not really. Not until a completely unrelated engineering breakthrough made the impossible merely difficult, and even then, we had to disguise the whole mission as something else just to get it funded." Elena managed a small, tired smile. "I don't think either of us won because the people around us finally saw sense. I think we won because we refused to stop long enough for anyone to talk us out of it." Cairo's hand finally left the console. 10 years, she said. "I used to calculate it in rotations, so it wouldn't feel so much like years. Somehow that made it easier." "I calculated it in shifts," Elena said. "Every graveyard rotation I ever worked, checking to see if the signal had gone quiet." "Did it ever?" "No," Elena said, "not once. Whoever was maintaining it never let it." Cairo allowed herself, finally, something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to count as one. "Then I suppose we were listening for each other the entire time," she said, "even before either of us knew the other existed." They walked the rest of the corridor in a silence that felt, for the first time in a decade, like the comfortable kind rather than the anxious kind. Near the airlock, Cairo paused once more, looking back down the darkened length of the passage behind them, at the rooms and workstations and quiet, improvised repairs that had defined every day of her adult life until this one. "I keep waiting to feel something larger than this," she admitted. "Relief, I suppose, or joy. Mostly I just feel tired in a way I don't think sleep is going to fix quickly." "That sounds right," Elena said. "I felt the same thing when the first confirmed reply came through on my end. Everyone around me was celebrating, and I mostly just wanted to sit down somewhere quiet and not have to explain myself to anyone for an hour." "What did you do instead?" "Filed a status report," Elena said, and Cairo laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch her as much as anyone. "That is a very human answer. It's the only kind I have." They walked the last stretch of corridor together, past the sealed hatches of the 2 ruined habitat rings that would never be repaired, past a memorial wall Cairo had maintained since the collision, names etched by hand into the metal because the vault's fabrication systems had never been able to spare the material for anything more formal. She paused there, running her fingers briefly over a cluster of names near the top. "My mother's," she said quietly, when Elena's silence made clear she'd noticed. "She kept the beacon before I did. She never got to know if it worked." "I think she'd know now," Elena said. "I think everyone whose name is on that wall would know, the same way I think about the people who dismissed my signal report for years and wonder if any of them ever found out they were wrong." "Do you resent them, the ones who doubted you?" Elena thought about that honestly before answering. "Some days, mostly I understand them. It's easier to believe something is nothing than to spend a decade of resources chasing a maybe. The people who doubted me weren't cruel. They were just choosing the safer kind of wrong." She looked at the wall of names. "The people who doubted you weren't cruel either. They were trying to keep the people in front of them alive, with the resources they actually had, instead of the resources they hoped might exist somewhere far away. That doesn't make it easier to have spent 10 years arguing against them." "No," Elena agreed. "It doesn't. I don't think it's supposed to. I think the hard version of hope is the only version that actually survives 10 years. The easy version gives out long before that." The Providence Line's return journey carried nearly 400 passengers who had spent over a decade believing, with varying degrees of conviction, that no answer was coming. Captain Voller filed his official mission report describing the voyage, accurately if a little dryly, as a successful long-range drive efficiency test that had additionally located and evacuated a stranded population, a description that satisfied the funding committees far more than the truth would have. The truth, Elena thought, watching Kyle adjust slowly to a ship far smaller and far more crowded than the vault she'd called home for a decade, was simpler and considerably less bureaucratic than any report could capture. Somewhere a signal had gone out into the dark with almost no reasonable hope of ever being heard, and rather than deciding that unlikely was the same as impossible, two separate groups of exhausted, stubborn people, on opposite ends of an unimaginable distance, had spent 10 years refusing to let that signal go quiet. It had taken a decade. It had taken a young researcher too stubborn to write the word inconclusive, a beacon keeper too stubborn to let a vote silence a promise, and one unrelated engineering discovery that turned an impossible rescue into a merely difficult one. None of it had been fast, none of it had been guaranteed. But somewhere behind the Providence line, an empty, drifting vessel finally sat in silence, its beacon dark for the first time in 11 years, not because anyone had given up on it, but because it had finally, after everything, done exactly what it was built to do. It had been heard. Years later, long after the Providence line completed its return journey, and the Hollow Vault survivors had settled, slowly and unevenly, into new lives scattered across human territory, Elena kept a single memento from the entire decade-spanning affair. It wasn't a commendation, though there were several. It wasn't a piece of the vault itself, though Kyle had offered her one, a small fragment of hull plating salvaged before the empty vessel was left to drift permanently in the dark. It was a single printed page, the very first anomaly report she'd filed at 23 years old, the one her supervisor had wanted labeled inconclusive, the word crossed out in her own handwriting and replaced, stubbornly, with 3 words that had taken her a decade to fully prove true. Still worth answering. She kept it on the wall of whatever office she happened to occupy, in whatever posting came next, less as a trophy than as a reminder, for herself and for anyone who asked about it, that the distance between a signal and a reply was never really measured in light years at all. It was measured in the number of people willing to keep listening and keep transmitting, long after everyone around them had quietly decided the silence meant nobody was there. Somewhere still, other signals were almost certainly repeating into the dark, patient and unanswered, waiting for someone stubborn enough to refuse the word inconclusive one more time.